Connecticut Historical Society. My name is Jody Blankenship. I'm the CEO here. Generations of Struggle, Civil Rights in Connecticut is part of the programming for our exhibit, Growing Up in Connecticut. In the exhibit, we explore common experiences of the challenges and opportunities and emotional highs and lows of childhood and adolescence, as well as the unique circumstances and events that shaped each generation. Our goal is to promote cross-generational understanding and conversation, both within the exhibit and with tonight's program. We would like to focus on how history can help us broaden our understanding of personal experiences, community engagement, and movements for social change. Now, while a formal announcement will be made on October 5th, I'm proud to let you know tonight that the Connecticut Historical Society has been designated an affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution. Yes, we're very proud. And we're pleased to include tonight's program in one of the events occurring across the country in Smithsonian's Lift Every Voice initiative that celebrates the African American experience and is part of the opening ceremonies of the new National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was told earlier today that they tweeted out this program to all the Smithsonian audiences, so we should be hearing hopefully from folks all over the country. Now, finally, I would like to introduce tonight's moderator, Stacy Close. Dr. Close is Associate Vice President of Equity and Diversity at Eastern Connecticut State University in Willimantic. Also a professor of history, Dr. Close received his PhD and MA from The Ohio State University and a BA from Albany State College in Georgia. And we are very fortunate to have him as a trustee of the Connecticut Historical Society. Also, if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the collections in the back. Mr. Costin was very nice to bring them tonight, and I think just some incredible pieces of our history. So please take a look after the lecture. Finally, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for donating their time and energy for the panel tonight. And I'd like to thank you, our members, donors, and sponsors for supporting the program tonight. Without you, none of this is possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Close.
Thank you, Jody. I would also like to thank Jenny Stedman for extending the email invitation for me to come out to the Connecticut Historical Society tonight to be part of the discussion of Generations of Struggle, Connecticut, and Civil Rights. What we'll do tonight is to first introduce you to our distinguished panel and then pose a few questions to them and allow them to respond to those questions. And then we'll give a chance to open the questions up to the audience. So first, let me begin with the introductions. We have Belong Ramiz Hall. She's an educator and an activist, originally from Bloomfield, Connecticut, currently serving as the director of the Multicultural Resource Center at Amherst College. She continues to push institutions and individuals to engage in true community building through social justice and equity work. Just give everybody a little wave. Thank you. We also have Tanaya Taylor, who was born and raised in Hartford, and she is a student at Trinity College and works at Hartford Food Systems Incorporated. She is involved in several projects in Hartford, including Summer of Solutions, Real Youth Hartford Film Festival, the Complete Streets Committee, and Bishi Co. Give everybody a wave, please. Thank you. And right next to her, we have retired Hartford Fire Department Chief Charles A. Teal Sr., who served as a firefighter in the city since 1982. He has long been active in the Hartford community, serving for 2 years as president of the Phoenix Society, a club of African American firefighters, as well as on the board of trustees for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Hartford, the United Way of the Capital Region, and also our own Connecticut Historical Society. So please, Chief Teal. And we also have Andrea Selden, the daughter of the legendary William Bill Brown. She grew up watching her father establish the Urban League of Greater Hartford, and he championed equal access to education, equal hiring practices, and led his leadership to the boards of many community organizations, including the Friends of the Community Renewal Team and the Sickle Cell Association of Connecticut. So, good people, this is our panel for tonight. And we begin this way. We first ask our panelists to share their memories and experiences of protests from the post-MLK assassination, or as some of the people I interviewed for my research said, the rebellion in Hartford, to the recent Moral Monday or Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, on that question, we'll start with Chief Teal.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here and to address that very timely question, I should say. Yes. I remember the time period very, very clearly, even though I was 13 years old at the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I remember the outpouring of emotion. Also very negative, very powerful, and very violent. Many people who lived in the city of Hartford will say that the response was actually unique. I know guys who were in the Vietnam War, and while in Vietnam were watching Hartford on the national news saying, what in the world is going on there? Just to give you an idea of what it was like, how it was different. Hartford is the only city in the nation who actually suffered the loss of a library branch during the riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was an outpouring of violent emotions like I've never witnessed before in my life and since then, in spite of all the years that have passed. In retrospect, I wish the response had been different. I can honestly tell you, and I've had the chance to do a lot of writing, and that cut this short. You can tell me when I'm talking too long, and I have to do that. But I've done a lot of writing since my retirement 6 years ago, and one of the books that I wrote is about a system of learning, understanding, and remembering information I created called Cheat Tools and Tools of Learning. And in this publication, I actually addressed this subject, so I better be consistent. I was not the kind of person to be violent during the aftermath of Martin Luther King, but I was quite apathetic. It was shortly prior to that we lost Malcolm X, and shortly prior to that we lost John F. Kennedy. It just seemed like, you know, as a child, that's the way life was. And you just got to the point where you honestly said to yourself, well, that's what life is really like, where you work yourself throughout your life, become a leader, and someone comes along and cuts your life short. Then I don't think I want to be a leader. And I went through an apathetic period of time in my life during that period of time, whereas most people were either violent or they were sometimes focused. And I think I'll cut it short right there, even though I continue on. I think I'll stop right there regarding that particular question.
Okay, and we'll give a chance for one of our other panelists to chime in.
Hi, Russ. I can only say, while I was a young teenager, reminiscing the last couple of days, it really brought it to the forefront in my mind. I remember clearly being very afraid, for my father, who, as you heard earlier, came to Hartford and started the Urban League here. He would get in his car and drive along the avenue and Main Street. He would get out and walk, go through the neighborhoods, trying to quell the violence that was happening. The last couple of days watching Charlotte, for several different reasons for me, it brought back a lot of emotions. I remember clearly the fear that we had for him, not knowing what his situation was going to be while he was out in the community trying to be the voice, trying to calm the masses. We were fearful for his safety, not knowing what was going to happen. It's very clear to me the last couple of days. We have a daughter who was in school in Charlotte, and just hearing her angst and her fear in her voice, it really brought it all back home for me. She doesn't know really what to expect, or she's never experienced anything like this before. And it just brought it back to me that at 14 and 15 years old, I was really feeling the same thing and being afraid for a parent who was out there fighting the fight. So my memories of Martin Luther King being shot, the riots of the 60s, it became very, very clear on yesterday and on today.
Now, for our other panelists who were not around during the time period, would you share some of your memories of when you first learned of the Black Lives Matter movement?
I can start. I believe I was in school when I first learned about the movement. I was going to a community college, just starting out, so I wasn't really in tune with the activism world. And as I started to become more educated about issues of the past, I saw that a lot of it really reflected about what was going on today. And I was surprised when, I'm in classes learning about Martin Luther King and Huey Newton, that the same, things are still going on. And I would have fights with my professor about racism being over, and we've come a long way. And I'll be like, no, look at Black Lives Matter. We're still doing this, and we're still fighting for the same injustices, but it's just it hasn't been recently. So that was my experience.
Just to name this, in case people don't know, Black Lives Matter was created after the non-indictment of, or the not-guilty verdict of George Zimmerman and the murder of Trayvon Martin, not after Michael Brown, right? Which most people think it was after Michael Brown was murdered. So I was actually living in California when Black Lives Matter first started on social media. I did not become aware of it until I was living in Kansas City, about 4 hours from Ferguson, when Michael Brown was murdered. And I was working at the University of Kansas, and a lot of my students were from the St. Louis and Ferguson area. And it was through organizing and protests from St. Louis to Kansas City to all around the country when I first got involved in activism in communities. And so I was involved in some activism and protests in Kansas City, Missouri, but was also involved in helping organize students at the University of Kansas. And so out of Black Lives Matter came a greater conversation about even student experiences, Black student experiences at predominantly white institutions and universities. And so that was kind of my relationship to Black Lives Matter and becoming more aware of what was happening in the world. So I remember sitting in an airport and watching a video of Michael Brown laying on the ground. And that was kind of my first introduction to Black Lives Matter as a movement.
Okay. In terms of the movement, do you find any overlap in the rhetoric of the civil rights movement and the rhetoric of the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think there are similarities in a call for justice and a call for, during the civil rights, what they call equality, which we call equity, which are different. Equity is about giving people the things that they need. Equality is about giving everyone the same thing. Everyone does not need the same things. I think the biggest difference is that Black Lives Matter is being led by Black queer women. And the civil rights movement was not. It was primarily Black clergy, Black male, churchgoers. And so in that way, Black Lives Matter, I think, is looking to create space for those that in the civil rights movement were kind of left out. Women, queer folks, disabled folks, poor folks, undereducated folks, trans folks, understanding that when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about all Black lives. We're not just talking about Black, cisgender, straight men. And so in that way, I think they are different because the leadership is different and the time in which this movement is happening is different. But I think the similarity is the call for justice and the call for, you know, Black liberation in some senses. Some folks would say that the civil rights was not about Black liberation, but was really about integration and getting along, in some senses. But that's, we can do that. That's really
same things that I see. I really appreciate that the movement today is being led by Black queer women. Something that really resonates with me when I look at the civil rights movement from the 1950s to 60s is that it does go back further than, you know, when you hear about MLK, you hear about Malcolm X. And I think about today with the movement we have now, and when in the 90s, Rodney King, everyone was rioting and going crazy. During the 1950s and 60s, that's when things really took off. But as you begin to like unravel this story, you see that a lot of people advocated for the Black sharecroppers of the South because they were getting, you know, basically robbed of like the hard work that they were doing. So I appreciate today because like Black Lives Matter calls for the you know, equity for Black people, but it's also like addressing like the economic injustices in queer people and all the other intersections that come with being oppressed. So that's something that I really appreciate when I look back.
I detect a difference that perhaps is more perception than reality, but my recollection of the time period following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. is that there seemed to be a movement toward political activity, professionalism, and things of that sort. And there was more of an outpouring of support from groups of people that I don't tend to see visible now. What I'm thinking about primarily are the actors, the athletes, things, people who are perceived as being prominent and respected in today's society. They don't come out like they used to. It's sort of like, well, maybe there's something that contract, I don't know. You know, something that says you can't be active when it comes to these things. But nowadays, I don't see them being active at all. It's almost like, I understand the importance of having a grassroots effort, but there should be more support among those individuals who, quite frankly, have made it, but they're not searching to assist. I don't see it. There's a big difference there that I can see.
I agree completely with Chief. The big difference that we see now, I see now, is the lack of leadership, shall we say, the lack of our community getting involved, and in your phrase, those of us who have made it, those of us who have gained the education, who have had the employment, they've had the jobs, the exposure. You don't see them involved in the Black Lives Matter. And that's a movement that seems as though it's standing on its own. And the difference in the civil rights movement is that everyone was together. The clerical, the ecumenical community was together. All of our people were assembling for the same movement, and we don't see that now.
Now, in terms of goals, my students in my history classes often ask me, what was the goal of the civil rights movement? If Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, as Chief Steele says, John Kennedy was assassinated, and Robert Kennedy was murdered, Malcolm X was assassinated. What was the goal of this movement?
I I've got the knife, I'll try. The overall goal seemed to be understanding that certain individuals in our society were certainly treated as second-class citizens. And that was made most evident in education. Initially, I should say, when the Supreme Court ruled the Brown versus Board of Education as separate but equal was against the law, we then had what Martin Luther King called nullification, interposition and nullification, where you simply have people saying, we don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're not going to abide by it anyway. And then you had things like the Southern Manifesto, which said, in essence, we, the congressmen and senators of the southern states, hereby agree that we are not going to allow certain people to get educated, et cetera, along those lines. There were some individuals, 3 of them. One in particular was Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, who became president of the United States. I believe he was a senator at the time, United States Senator at the time. But there just seemed to be, at that point in time, the need to emphasize that we certainly have the right to obtain an education and also to serve in various positions. And there also was a matter of housing. Those were the 3 main things that I detected at that time. But nowadays, it's kind of shifted towards not just having the right to do those things, but the basic right to live. You know, I took, my bicycle was a shambles. I ride my bike all the time instead of my car. So I rode my bike, Bloomfield Bike Shop, and wanted to walk back and a little exercise, about an hour walk. And on my way back, I had to walk to Bloomfield, West Hartford, and Hartford. Walked to Bloomfield, feeling pretty good. West Hartford got a little bit nervous. Why? Because of all the negative things that are in the press about, you know, what happens with the town of West Hartford and the police. It changes your perception, and if it changes your perception, now you've got a synergistic effect. You've got potentially negative or errant behavior by a police officer and a fearful black man, which can create quite a challenging situation. I'm aware of this. I'm walking. I'm a retired fire chief. Public safety is, I know just about everyone in public safety, and they know me too. But still, I had that fear. I don't know if I addressed what you were talking about. Maybe you try to restate the question. Kind of driven.
Well, I have to ask you to use the other mic, just learn that picking up properly.
Got it.
Now, in terms of Hartford, to bring the issue more close home, how was the movement not only impactful in Hartford, but what were the goals of the Urban League, the NAACP in Hartford in that late 1966 period?
Oh, I wonder why I have the mic. To my knowledge, and I am not an employee of the Urban League, but I certainly did live the life. First and foremost, it was about education. And we heard that 24/7 in our house. That was the key. Education. You get a good education, you'll be set. So education was first and foremost. It was employment, it was housing. It was home ownership, not just housing, but home ownership. And those were the pieces that I saw people come through our home to have the living room and the kitchen table conversations of how do we make this happen. The meetings, the schedules of corporate America, how do we've got to get into that boardroom because we need those jobs, and this is how we're going to have to do it. We've got to get later on, we've got to get out on that golf course because that's where the networking starts. That's where it happens. And so those were the things, to my recollection, that were first and foremost with the League, with my dad. Education, jobs, housing, getting into home ownership, health and education obviously was up there. You've got to have your education, you've got to take care of your body, you've got to take care of your mind. All those things play together, so those were the goals.
Okay. Now, a few months ago, I saw a reporter on one of our national television shows interviewing members of the Black Lives Matter movement. The reporter asked quite pointedly, what's the goal of the Black Lives Matter movement? He said he understood the goals of the civil rights movement, but then he said, what are the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, blacklivesmatter.com is a website you can go to. It is created by the founders of Black Lives Matter. It lays out all of their goals, their values, who they are, what they're about. I apologize if I sound frustrated with the question, and it's because it's a question that's asked constantly, and there is an answer, and it's online, and it's available to all people to just go and look it up. But to answer the question, in short, the goal is Black liberation. That is the main goal of Black Lives Matter, is Black liberation in all of its forms for all Black people. That includes housing and education and economic opportunity and freedom to express who you are, accessibility services, communities free of police violence and police brutality, the ability to have children and have them grow up and be free and alive. And it's a reproductive justice issue. It's a poverty issue, right? It's an economic issue. It's a community issue. And so blacklivesmatter.com, if you have not visited it, you should. The answers are there. How to get resources and information is there. And had that reporter done his homework, he wouldn't have asked that question. But that's all I can say.
Yeah, everything she said. But I also wanted to say that Black Lives Matter is for the liberation of Black people, and a lot of people get that mistaken with, oh, well, why aren't, like, white people don't have the same thing? What about Latinos, or, what about this group of people? And I just wanted to address it because it's important that we understand that as soon as, like, Black people are liberated and as soon as we get, like, true freedom, everyone is good. And people, like, sometimes fail to understand that. If you're, like, so far at the bottom and we finally get up there, then, like, no one else has to worry. And also, Black Lives Matter is for, living well and being able to grow up and grow old. And it's not a reaction to Black death. And that's another thing people get, shaken up about, because every time, there's another police shooting, you see the hashtag, like, more and more. And I just want to address, like, I still say Black Lives Matter, even though, like, no one died that hour.
Yes, sir.
My general sense is that the reason why there is the organization Black Lives Matter and not some other life matters is because I liken it to many of the experiences that I had during my previous career in the fire service. If there was a building on fire, pardon me, please, and you responded, and all of the companies that were on the scene paid attention to the building next door or across the street, we would be criticized, ridiculed, and charged with a crime. The crime being you didn't put forth the time and effort to apply the resources where they were most needed. What I sense from the Black Lives Matter movement is they did something comparable to what firefighters do. They estimated the situation and determined a course of action. The situation was worse here than it is anywhere else. And so we're going to apply the resources necessary to correct the problem here first. That sounds like common sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the issue of hope, my parents told me that the civil rights movement brought hope to a generation of young people in Southwest Georgia, where I grew up. Was that same message a part of the the rhetoric or the speech of parents here in the greater Hartford area.
Okay. That sounds a little bit like where my grandparents came from. Webster County, Georgia, anywhere in that area? No?
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah, well, you know, when I became president of the Board of Trustees for the Connecticut Historical Society, I was actually standing in that same area where I took the oath of office. And I shared with everyone in attendance that my first history teachers were my grandparents. And they came from Plains and Americus, Georgia. And I've heard those stories on many occasions. And my grandmother would tell me wonderful things about how Hartford and the rest of the region of Connecticut was when I was 5 years old up until the time I was about 9, 10 years old. And my grandfather would walk into my grandmother's kitchen and tell me about the way things were in the South. And the difference was so great, so vast, that in essence, I fell in love with the history of the state of Connecticut and the history of the city of Hartford. The lessons that I received were, I think, somewhat different. You know, I think about a teacher I once had when I attended Springfield College. And he said, we come to a discussion with a certain amount of baggage, and each of us has different baggage, and when we open it up, we have different experiences, is what he's referring to. And I think what I'm trying to say is, my experiences were quite unique in the sense that because my grandparents came from such hard times, they had descendants who applied themselves in unique ways. I had a cousin in 1960 who was a police officer. That's highly unusual in the city of Hartford, a police officer, Walter McBride. And my wife, Helene, had a cousin that was a police officer also, Matt Bolden. But in any event, because of these two gentlemen, I knew them both when I was a child, my method of interacting with police officers is very different. So, you know, my experience is slightly different. But the message that was shared in the South was comparable to the message we had in the North, except in the South they were dealing more so with segregation than discrimination. And another book that I had the opportunity to write was The Making of a Legend, The Life and Times of Walter J. Doc Hurley. And Doc Hurley used to talk about a quality education and how important that was. And we all talked about education, but here we're kind of fooled. We're under the impression that, yeah, we're getting an education, and we're not. And I think the narrative changes somewhat different, is somewhat different in the North than it is in the South, because the show is there, but there's nothing quality. We literally have students who have graduated from high school in the city of Hartford who cannot read their own diploma. That I know for a fact. I do tutoring and teaching right now, reading, writing, and math. And I met some students like that at the Caribbean Resource Center, the Center for Urban Research, Education, and Training on Albany Avenue. Remarkable. But in any event, the narrative may have been similar in a sense between North and South, but it was different in the sense that one was so subtle, that discrimination, and the other one was more blatant segregation. But in some ways, segregation had its benefits.
I'll come back to that point, Chief.
This question is about hope, right?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, growing up, there was really no hope. I grew up pretty poor. We were way below the poverty level for a lot of my life. My mother worked all the time, so there was no embedding like, oh, things will get better. I definitely learned about like all the movements in school, and you know, I was in this mindset that okay, this is fine. Like, you know, starving, going to bed hungry is fine. That's really like, that really is like embedded in you when you like grow up in poverty, and it's really oppressive. So a lot of the times, you said earlier about figures and leaders that have made it out and they don't make statements and they don't stand up. And I want to say that the art that you know, some artists when I grew up created, or the people that I looked up to, that's where I found hope. Like today when I look at Colin Kaepernick and what he's doing with the NFL and how everyone else is following his lead, and are actually taking a stand against police brutality and other, matters for us. That's where I found my hope. Like, it wasn't necessarily through my parents, but it was from like artists and leaders and, people that I could read about. And I think that's an important thing to note.
And Chief, I said I was going to come back to your question, but if Ms. Selden, you want?
My experience was just a tad different. I was born in the South, in Virginia, moved to Detroit, Michigan, moved again to South Bend, Indiana. My dad was originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and my mom was from Evanston, Illinois. So we had a real melting pot going on in our house. My maternal grandmother was mixed with Choctaw Indian, and my paternal grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, I guess, was a slave. So we had an education going on, and as Chief talks about the conversations that go on when you're having those stories in the evening with your grandparents and they're sharing that wisdom, there was a lot of wisdom going on in our household, things that we were exposed to that we didn't necessarily find in a book. There wasn't necessarily someone in your neighborhood that had the same experience that you did. And then coming to Connecticut as a teenager, it was very, very different here. Indiana is quite southern in its ways. So the segregation, the subtlety of racism as we saw it here in Connecticut, it was in your face in Indiana. There was no doubt about that. So it was very different for us, and we gathered hope from a lot of the stories that we got from different family members, and you kind of put those all in the back of your mind and figured out a way to make it work for you.
Okay, thank you. And Chief, the point you make about segregation was actually, I first heard it made by someone from T-Town, from Greenwood, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they talked about the benefits of having a world of segregation. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the point you were about to make.
Well, the comparison I'm inclined to make is based on what I was referring to earlier, the book that I had the opportunity to write regarding Walter Doc Hurley's life. He was a star athlete in the city of Hartford, the only person in the history of Weaver High School that's been here since 1923 to get 4 letters in each of the major sports. Got a scholarship to go to Virginia State University. While he's there, World War II broke out. He quit college, joined the military. I mean, he did everything that you're supposed to do in order to prove that you are indeed a contributing member of society for a person of his age. Got a job in the South in Virginia as a coach, coached 3 different sports, won state championships in each of the 3 different sports. His mother got sick, he came back to Hartford. And while he was here in Hartford, he said, well, surely I can get a job as a coach. After all, came from here, distinguished as a coach in Virginia, he never could. He never got the chance to serve as a coach in the city of Hartford. And it was because of blatant discrimination. But under segregation, he was able to achieve his goals. It's a dilemma, and he literally said, and I'm quoting him at this point, he said, one is terrible, the other is worse. Which one is which? You decide.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, as far as the Black Lives Matter movement, a number of children see the protest on television, and seeing the protest on television, they inherently ask the question, what is this movement all about? So how do you explain to children what Black Lives Matter is all about?
I have the fortunate privilege of having a 9-year-old brother, And we often have conversations about race and Black Lives Matter and protests and what's going on in the world. As two children who primarily navigate white spaces, both of us have, went to private school. He's in private school right now. And so it's, I think, to be frank, I think it is a product of white supremacy to lie to children. And I think it is our duty as adults and as people with more knowledge and information and resources and skill to be honest with them. To be honest with them about the reality of the world, to be honest with them about the hope of the world, and about their innate power and ability to change the world. And so, I have very frank and honest conversations with my brother, and often they are questions, right? What do you think is happening? What have you experienced in school? Like, how do you get along with your friends? Do you feel like you are treated differently ever? Why do you think that is? And helping them come to some of those realizations on their own. Because, Black children especially do not have the privilege to not talk about race. That's a privilege afforded to white people. Often, I work in colleges and universities, and I have students who are like, oh, I've never thought about my race before, and they're 21 years old. And it's because they grew up in, white suburbia where they didn't ever have to think about their racialized identity. Black children are not afforded that. We see that with Tamir Rice, right? 12-year-old boy shot in a park playing with a BB gun, only because someone called and thought he was an adult man playing with a real gun in a park. It baffles me still. But we have to be honest with our children. Like Yolo Akili says, radical honesty is, honesty is the key to our liberation. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest with our children. We have to be honest with each other. And in that way, that's when we start to change the world. The United States of America has a problem with honesty. We don't know how to be real. We don't know how to tell the truth. And it's why we're in the situation we're in now, is because we're still lying about our history and our past and how we got to where we are. And so it's very convenient for a lot of folks to live in the lie of what Ta-Nehisi quotes, in the lie of the dream, right? The American dream. And that's what it is. It's a lie. So we need to be honest, and we need to especially be honest with our babies.
Yeah, I have an 11-year-old brother, and I lie to him all the time. I definitely can't talk to him about anything, and I do this for work. I talk to 14 through 18-year-olds about race, about, police brutality and school-to-prison pipeline, oppression. I can say all these things. It's like mechanic, like I'm a robot, but every time I look at my brother, I'm just like, how do I have this talk with you? It's like I would rather explain sex and drugs to him than tell him about like what police brutality is or our current state of affairs. And every time we sit down, I just look at him, and the closest I've got was, I said, do you know who Mike Brown is? And he said, no. Do you know who Tamir Rice is? And he says, no. And I'm like, do you know who Trayvon Martin is? He's like, yeah, I think I heard of that name. And I'm just like, well, you're 11. I'm going to have to tell you. But every time I get to spend time with him, it just, honesty is great, but like telling the truth takes a lot of emotional labor. Even doing this talk today, I knew that it would be draining. So I took the day off of work and school. I'm just like, I have to talk about all this stuff. I'm just gonna like chill for the day so I can go do this. So like having those talks with him for me, and doing all, expending all that energy and all this emotional labor, it's really been tough. So I think I have to like go to Boulong and ask her for some advice.
As far as our panelists, how have the movements that you have been involved in and influenced by shaped your lives as adults?
For me, it was driven in my brain that, as I said before, first and foremost, it's about education. When I was fortunate enough to have my children, I then went back to my own upbringing and seeing and remembering how I was raised. It was very important in our household. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was in and out. He was in the community, he was in the house, he was in the schools, he was in the church, he was everywhere. My mom's job, we were children of the 50s. My mom's job was the children. And so for my sister and I, that became forefront when we had our children. That's what you did. You were involved with your children in every aspect of their life from the time they had their first breath. I still do that sometimes. My son doesn't like it too much, but I'm still involved. It's very important, and I think that that shapes who you are, what you grew up with, and how you raise your children. For us, it was about knowing your children, being there for them, being a part of your community. Know your community, get involved, that you're out there and you do the volunteer work. You get involved, and somehow the two things will come together, and hopefully you will have success, and it seems to have worked so far.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure if I know how to answer this question, but a different path. I took an entirely different path. I remember the days when Bill Brown was trying to give us direction when we were kids. I remember working during the summer, and I got the sense that they were just trying to keep us off the street. That's what I really did. I didn't think they wanted to give us work. They just wanted to keep us off the street and keep us from getting into trouble. But when I hit 14 years of age, I just said, I'm done with it, and back right out of society. We used to call it like dropping out of society. I literally dropped out of high school when I was 14. So after drifting for about 3 or 4 years, had a nice conversation with Walter Doc Hurley. That's what led me to write the book about him. And he sent me to go see a man by the name of Bill Edmonds, who was a counselor at Greater Hartford Community College, which was right up the street here. It's now part of Capital Community College. But when I told Mr. Edmonds what I had been doing, he looked at me and he said, do you know how many people spent their lives, risked their lives, and sometimes gave their lives so you could have the opportunity to succeed? So what he was telling me was, in essence, all of the challenges that we've faced that got us to this point. Now, keeping in mind that I was kind of a history buff and still am, but I knew about a lot of other people too. I knew that, we have the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, which is a couple of stones throw from here, and she wrote the book on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and reportedly Abraham Lincoln said to her, so you're the little lady that started this great big war. I knew about John Brown and how he and his sons lost their life fighting so that we could be free. I mean, I knew about a lot of things. So I've tried to be very balanced and giving people the benefit of the doubt, and because of that, I've had a great relationships with people from all walks of life. Jewish people, Irish, particularly the Irish. I used to spend most of my time in this building, spare time in this building, with a guy by the name of Billy Dwyer. He was a captain in the Hartford Fire Department, came to the job in 1936, and another guy by the name of Timmy Kelleher. It was through those guys that I developed the pride in the profession that I had. I mean, they professionalized the Hartford Fire Department. So I guess I've given credit to people for their contributions from all walks of life. I look at the photographs of people who were the Freedom Riders that went down south to register people to vote from here. I mean, they were setting fire to the buses they were trying to go down there, but some of them were white. So I give credit to people until they're proven otherwise, that you will treat me as an equal, and I reciprocate. But just one point that I wanted to make, and possibly is related to something else. Oh, I know what it was. We were talking about the difficulty of talking about, telling the truth about things in this country. And I think it has something to do with the reaction that I had to my teacher, Mrs. Vasquez. She was the one in the 5th grade who told the members of my class, predominantly black group of school children, that black people were once slaves. We said, lies. You're a liar. That's not true, et cetera, et cetera. We went home, talked to our parents, et cetera, came to find out it was true. That's a tough thing for a person to do, because she literally brought us on 6 separate field trips this woman, Mrs. Vasquez, but she will always be remembered as the person who first told me that black people weren't slaves in the United States of America. She knew she would have to wear that for the rest of the school year and possibly the rest of her life. So I interact with some people nowadays who don't understand that the past is prologue, as William Shakespeare said. The past is prologue. And someday the things that we are creating right now will be a part of the past and determine what the young people of today are going to be like. Yes, it's important to keep that in mind.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. How do panelists see the movements shaping their lives as adults?
Oh, that's hard because I don't feel like an adult still. The movement shaping my life. You know, a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of it stems from like economic disparities between black people and white people, or, you know, poor people and wealthy people. And that's something that, you know, kind of brought me to like what I do now and where I am today. I used to work at a wholesale club, and it was like a grocery store. And this was when I was 19 and I was on my own. I had my own apartment, so I would have to work like these 48 hours a week. So I would be there all the time, and it was like home. And I would have like regular customers that I would talk to all the time. And there was one man, he was just like, you know, I have a yacht, I'm so rich. And I'm like, great. So I used to have these conversations with him, and he's like, what have you done? And I'm just like, I donated to the whales. And he's like, don't you like not have money? And I was like, you're right. So he's like, why don't you like invest your time and, you know, do something else? And, you know, aside from him being awful, like that was the best thing that he told me, because I'm 19 working at this wholesale club. There's like no future in retail unless you're, you know, motivated. So I started to volunteer for Literacy Volunteers, and it was such great work, and I really enjoyed helping people. And then from Literacy Volunteers, I got a job at like my college, and then I started helping more people, and it just kind of like ignited this fire. Like I just wanted to do more and like touch more people. So like every step of the way where I'm trying to like undo like all the injustices that have been done through like education. Right now I'm doing food work and whatever else I find in the future. I feel like that is, did I answer it? What shaped me as an adult that I am?
I guess I also don't feel like an adult, really. No. You know, I think what Black Lives Matter did for me specifically, it gave me a community that I did not have previously, which I am deeply grateful for. And it helped build in me a sense of, you know, unapologetic, radical Black womanness that I think existed before, but not in the way that it does now. And so in that way, seeing, you know, and I don't consider myself a like on the ground activist, right? I see, you know, Black women in the street in front of lines of police with sage trying to bless the devil out of them. And I'm not doing that, right? And so I appreciate that, and I see myself in them, and they give me strength and power to sit here and talk to you all and do the work that I do in predominantly white spaces, and not apologize for showing up in the way in which I show up. You know, knowing that my, you know, great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother and stuff could not sit in front of a group of white folks and say white supremacy out loud. That was not a thing that could happen. And so, you know, I say it proudly and unapologetically, and do the work that I do without much fear. And not like fear of bodily physical harm, but just like an innate fear. Like I don't really care about how people are receiving me anymore. Because ultimately, I'm doing this work for the liberation of my people, you know, because at the root of it, I love them You know, I love my brother, I love my parents, I love my husband, I love, you know, my ancestors that I like to think were in cotton fields every single day, working hard because I am their dream and I'm living their dream. And so that is what, you know, that is so deeply rooted in me, and that is what pushes me and guides me and helps me, you know, get up every morning and go to work and sit in meetings all day, and advocate for my students and advocate for those who are most vulnerable, right? Yeah, I am unapologetic. That is how I am, yes.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we want to open up the floor for questions from the audience. If you have questions for our panelists and you wanted to direct the question to one particular panelist, you may do so. And I believe that Jenny has the mic, and she will be, I think she described herself as the Oprah Winfrey runner for this event.
Get a little exercise. I don't think this is on. Hello?
It's only for the camera, so you're gonna.
Oh, okay. I heard today, or I saw today, I read today that a U.S. court judge deemed having locks is a crime when you're going to interview for a job. Now, that underlying behavior was always current in the black community when you presented yourself back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when going for their job. You had to have a jerry curl, straightened hair, and everything. That's why I have locks today, because my hair wants to be what it is. And that's me. And now I'm deemed unfit for a job? Are you kidding me? It feels like Nazi Germany all over again. And we in this room who live and breathe and be who we're supposed to be should stand up for one another and say, that's enough. Are you kidding me? That's insane. But that's the incendiary first move of foul behavior and underlying behavior. When is that going to stop? Drop the mic.
Any response from our panelists? Sure.
I don't think we need to respond to that. I would just like to give shout out to Margot, who was one of the adults present in my life when I was growing up. And I love you, thank you for being here. Because this is that, there's nothing else to say. Yes, we need to do more, and we need to be better, and we need to be together in that, absolutely.
If I may. All rational people arrive at conclusions based upon the premises. And a premise is a fact or a group of facts that help to support a conclusion. Anyone who can come up with a conclusion like your hair is a crime is a totally irrational human being, in response to the comment that I just heard. The thing that I wanted to add to that is simply this. They don't represent this country. Irrational people don't represent this country. Unfortunately, they get the most attention.
But it's a law, Charles. It's a law. It's a U.S. law now.
There are a lot of laws that need to be changed. Irrational laws, no question about it. But they don't represent this country. And the point that I'm simply trying to make is, if they did represent this country, we would have no chance of getting ahead. And there would be no such thing as President Barack Hussein Obama.
And I think we had, okay.
I worked at Capital Community College for years. Can you hear me? Or can I speak louder? I worked at Capital Community, is that better? I worked at Capital Community College for years. I worked as an UNTUC. I worked at Westlake School, etc. I have some background in education. With all due respect, sister, it's not a law. What happened was a circuit court made a ruling, and rulings of circuit court become case law in the areas where those judges reside. So there are X number of circuit courts throughout this country. They're a part of the appellate division of our court system, and they go up all the way to the Supreme Court. Basically, what they said was that an employer had the right to fire you if you had dreads, meaning that an employer could set job standards, dress standards for a workplace. And in those workplace job standards, they could place workplace job standards in terms of hair. Now, if you remember, the military still is doing this. Now, I'm not speaking in terms of favoring it. I'm just trying to be clear about it. They're tyrants. I don't question any of that. I'm just trying to be clear about their level of tyrancy or tyranny, okay? But it's important to understand that each area, certain appellate courts are biased and very conservative. So if you are a conservative and you want if you want a conservative ruling, you go to one of the more conservative appellate courts. Again, it's not law, it's case law. Case law becomes law, but it only says that employers in that area of that appellate decision can make job requirements based on what they see fit. And here is one of those things that they see fit. So true, if you're applying for a job in that particular appellate district, they can turn around and not hire you or fire you based on your hair. Either way, it's appalling. But I wanted to be clear, it's not, if it had been done by the Supreme Court, it would be nationwide law. Because it was done by a certain district court, it's only the rules in that area. Now, it's abhorrent. I'm not saying any of that. I'm not trying to cut them any slack. But I do want to be clear about where the absurdity is. And certain sections of our country, as we know, have a cuckoo, gaga, Google mentality. And they do all kinds of things. As I said, the military still has this issue. The Marine Corps allows dreads, but the rest of the military areas do not allow women or men to wear dreads. So it's a fight that continues to go on.
I think since we're talking about hair and these sort of politics of what's respectable, what's considered appropriate, I wonder if the panelists could touch on criticism of the Black Lives Matter movement from older generations of civil rights leaders saying that there's a way to protest that's respectable and there's a way, there's some kind of way to do this politely, and what that looks like. What do you think about that?
Yes. So a part of the Black Lives Matter's values is intergenerational work, right? And so I want to name that first, is that they believe in doing this work, the organization, right? There's the mantra and then there's the organization. In doing this work cross-generationally and ridding the work of ageism that can happen. And understanding historically that respectability politics, in my opinion, comes from a place of fear. In order to be safe, I have to be seen as a respectable Negro. I have to be seen as someone worthy of my life. And that means complying with police. That means wearing straight hair. That means dressing a certain way. That means talking a certain way. That means having a certain level of education. And like I said, it is all rooted in white supremacy and what white folks deem to be respectable. And so I personally reject that. And I think the Black Lives Matter organization as a whole rejects respectability politics. I think there are
plenty of ways to protest and to do activism. Polite sit-ins are one of the ways, you know. Marching and blocking down highways is one of the other ways, you know. Doing various rallies or petitions are other ways, right? There's a lot of different ways to do protest and activism, and there is space for all of it, right? It's not an either or, it's a both and, right? We need all of it to happen. And so I think the singular idea of this is the way you're supposed to do it is narrow, and not, it is not the world we're living in anymore. It's not 1960 anymore, you know, it's 2016. And our ability to be out and be present and be unapologetic in the way in which we demand justice has changed. And Martin Luther King blocked highways and streets too. You know, we conveniently forget that. So, you know, and yeah, so that's what I will say.
Just, you know, echoing off of what she said, I really look up to Black Panthers and the leaders in that movement. And when I look at Huey P. Newton, a lot of the things, you know, when people think about them, they're portrayed as these violent beings. And it was, you know, we know that it was an act of self-defense because, you know, things were very turbulent and they did get harassed by police. And, you know, we know, I don't want to say Fred Hampton's, you know, ultimate demise was through violence. So there has never been a peaceful revolution. I don't know where people are getting that from, but when you know, look at France, for example, America, you know, there has never been anything like that was peaceful, because when has anyone ever moved when you softly tap them on the shoulder? Excuse me, you can't get anyone to turn around and move out of your way. You have to, you know, you have to shove a little bit.
I have two questions to ask that I was just thinking about while I was here. The first question, in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she mentions that before 1975, there weren't really a lot of African Americans and Latinos that were incarcerated. The levels of incarceration increased after 1975. And then, as we saw through the 80s and the 90s, incarceration increased, and we began to see more black-on-black crime, which exists, and also criminal activity as far as killing one another. The question I would like to address is, when you talk about lynchings, and we talk about white supremacy, because it goes hand in hand, when you look at South Chicago, you look at a lot of other inner cities and urban areas where we're killing each other, why is it that our movement is not also focusing on some of those activities that are going on within our community, and so that we can shed light on that as well? The next question I would like to address too as well is, when you look at income, you look at skin color, the divisions that exist within the black community overall, do you think that would actually hinder our movement? Or will we actually, this would be a time where we can actually embrace and it'll move us forward based on our own divisions that exist within our own culture? Thank you.
Black Lives Matter does address black-on-black crime, whatever that means, because there's also white-on-white crime, there's also Asian-on-Asian crime, there's also Latino-on-Latino crime. Most crime happens intra-racially because we live in segregated communities. So I wish we would stop talking about black-on-black crime. I really do. And like I said, Black Lives Matter is about all black folk, right? The people who are not participating in Black Lives Matter who may identify as black might be struggling with some homophobia, with some misogyny, with some, you know, other isms and stuff, transphobia, right, that they're dealing with, where they cannot fully participate in an organization that is led by black queer women. Though it is a decentralized movement, there are leaders that are very visible in Black Lives Matter, so I reject that notion as well. So, you know, I struggle with this whole, we don't talk about black-on-black crime. We have had black organizers in black communities in Hartford, in Chicago, in Atlanta, in name all the black cities you can think of, before Black Lives Matter was even a thing publicly, right? black men in Hartford specifically, right, have been organizing on Albany Avenue since I was a kid. So just because it's not getting mass media, recognition does not mean that it does not exist. And so I wanna problematize that a little bit.
All right. I think we can take one more question.
This is not going to work. Hi, everyone. I'm Rosalyn Sotero. I am the director of a at-risk Puerto Rican program in Waterbury. I just wanted to ask, and it's probably going to be pointed to Bulong because I know you have both identities, but obviously anybody who can answer it can answer it. You mentioned that Black Lives Matter is specifically for all black people, regardless of identities. That includes Latinidad. Obviously, you are Latina as well. I'm wondering, do you think that, because there's huge anti-blackness in the Latino community, and there are plenty, with that being said, there are plenty of Latinos who don't even identify as black or who don't want to associate themselves with African Americans specifically, but want to maintain their blackness. And that's like a whole level of conversations there. I'm wondering, do you think that Black Lives Matter in any capacity reaches out to non-African American communities, like specifically and directly, to make sure like this movement is for you, this involves you as well, you are affected by these things? Or do you think that's more of a responsibility on specifically Latino leaders or Afro-Latino leaders?
Yeah, I'm not connected to a Black Lives Matter organization, so I don't want to necessarily do it or don't.
I don't know. What I will say, one of the values of Black Lives Matter is addressing undocumented black folk. And that's specific, I think, to the United States and understanding like the climate around undocumented people here. But that the realization that it's not just Mexicans that are undocumented in the United States, right? There are black people here who are undocumented as well. And so I think that kind of charge may be an entry into thinking about what building relationship with Afro-Latinos looks like. And yeah, and I don't really know. I know there's a lot of solidarity movements, right? Black Lives Matter in solidarity with Palestine, Black Lives Matter in solidarity with Puerto Rico, Black Lives Matter solidarity with No Dapple happening out in the Dakotas. But, and I think there are a lot of Afro-Latinos involved maybe in Black Lives Matter, but I don't know about leadership and what that looks like. So anti-blackness is definitely an issue in Latino communities as well as in black communities. And the idea that we don't want to be like those African Americans is an issue of international black folks as well, right? I talked to most of my students at Amherst and at my previous institutions. Most of the black students were international students, not black Americans. And they talk a lot about their socialization around their blackness, right? And being other than those African Americans, right? Because of the stigma around what it means to be African American in the United States and the messaging that they received from their parents and from their various countries where they are from. And so it's a conversation that definitely needs to happen more amongst black folk and from all walks of life in all areas in all countries. And I don't know how in depth that is currently happening.
Just a source, Rosa Clemente, she writes a lot about that right now, so you probably already know.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of our time, folks. So let's please give, if the audience would, a hearty thank you to our panelists for their time, and also to the Connecticut Historical Society and to all of you. And I think our panelists would be happy to take one or two questions individually, but to everyone here, please have a great night and safe journey home.